Good evening, everyone. When I first accepted this invitation to give this lecture, I had two thoughts. First of all, I was terrified it was going to rain, given we're coming out to Brownsea Island, and thankfully it hasn't rained. I was also terrified nobody would turn up. That was my biggest worry. And now I'm terrified that all of you have turned up, so I'm not sure really what's worse. So I'm conscious we are due in for a cafe for some food and wine shortly, and I don't want to keep you unnecessarily, but for now, I shall do my best to talk around this subject here, which is aquatic invaders. And I'm going to give you some examples from my research that really highlight some of the issues which I think are very important to us today. But before I do so, I think I'd better just check that we're all happy with what we're talking about. So if you turned up today thinking aquatic invaders, I was going to be talking about Vikings and Norsemen coming over from Scandinavia to invade, then I'm really sorry. You're going to be very, very disappointed, okay? But, you know, if you want to just make your way out and walk around the island, that's perfectly fine. I won't be insulted. But if you were thinking you're going to be talking, or you're going to be learning around species such as this guy down here, the American signal crayfish, this guy here, the North American largemouth bass, this one here, this is a freshwater shrimp from the Black Sea area, then you're in the right place. So we're all happy so far? Mm-hmm. That's good, excellent stuff. Now, I'm going to hand out an example of one of these guys in a moment, mainly because when the time comes when I should do it, I will completely forget, okay? So just in case you haven't come across invasive species before, I do have some of these guys, some American signal crayfish. They're looking a little bit sorry for themselves, okay? Mainly because they're no longer alive, okay? So that's probably a relief to some of you. It's a relief to me they didn't come back alive. But they were part or collected as part of a piece of research. They've been in the deep freeze for quite a long time, and so consequently they've only been defrosting for a couple of hours. So they shouldn't smell too much, okay, I promise you. But if they do pong a bit, then I do apologise. So I'm going to pass these round to the two Johns to pass them round. These actually crayfish are quite interesting ones, and I'll talk about them a bit more in a few minutes. But these are actually quite small crayfish in the context of how big this particular species can get, okay? You'll also notice most of them only have one claw. They should have two, okay? I'd like to say it's because they've been fighting each other. It's probably because I was a bit clumsy when I defrosted them. But building on what I mean by an aquatic invader, the important thing to understand is, first of all, an invader tends to, or should really be, a non-native species. But not all non-native species will become invasive. So first of all, to be an invader, I suppose an aquatic invader has to be in water, but let's just talk about invaders. You need to be transported, because we're talking about species being taken from a different part of the world and introduced into another where it shouldn't be naturally. So you need to be transported, and then you need to be introduced. Now that process is actually very, very difficult for a species. It's very easy to actually die at that point and not even succeed, okay? So between here and here, very often you might see only 10% of species get through that first barrier. To succeed, what do I mean by success? I don't mean they win a football match. What I really mean is they establish a population. And when I say establish, what I'm really meaning, they form a population which is then sustainable, okay? It can produce multiple generations year on year on year. If they don't, establish, then of course you just have an introduction. And indeed we have many species like that. So those of you who know a bit more about fish, for example, then maybe species like the European catfish, okay? Live a very long time, but certainly not established in this country. But if they do succeed, to be invasive, you have to invade. So you need to spread, you need to disperse into the wider environment. And arguably, you need to also be causing impact. okay? But some people may disagree with that one, but certainly you need to be able to disperse. So if you were introduced into Poole Harbour, your ability to disperse is quite easy. You've seen the big tide running this evening. When that tide goes out, you'd be dispersed potentially right out into the sea and beyond. If you're introduced into a garden pond, well, unless someone comes along and picks you up and moves you, you're stuck, okay? So actually, this dispersal, very, very important. But again, before I really move on to sort of the meat of my talk, what I really also want to kind of put over to you guys is, well, why should you be interested? Okay? And I would argue one reason for that, a major reason, is these species are all around us in our environment. It's very difficult to escape them. So if you go shopping for the weekend into central Bournemouth, have a wander down into the gardens, there's the bandstand, here's the river going out into the sea, you'll see lots of not red squirrels, the opposite, the grey squirrels, okay? And indeed they're so tame, you can feed them by hand. Is that a good thing? Well, arguably it is. You're getting people to interact with nature. The flip side of that, of course, is these are a North American species, albeit been here quite a long time. They've dispersed quite widely, so we can say they're invasive. But we can also say they're invasive because they are also having quite a damaging impact on red squirrels. So another reason, to come back to John's talk earlier, why we're on Brownsea, well, it's a really good example of a good refugia for red squirrels, okay? Because they're protected from catching this disease carried by the grey squirrel. The grey squirrel doesn't have any damage from it. The red squirrel clearly does. So it's a big driver in why we have so few red squirrels other than on Brownsea Island. You came over in the boat over Poole Harbour, yeah? It wasn't too long ago, okay? Manila Clam. Where's Roger? Here's Roger. If you want to know about Manila Clam, talk to this gentleman down the front, okay, after we finished. But you will find Manila Clam in the harbour. It is fished for. You probably can't see the detail on here, but it's worth millions of pounds per year as a fishery. Great benefits are coming from that. But elsewhere in the world, at least, Manila clams are causing impacts. Okay? So again, non-native species locally within our own environment. This is some work that I did with Pete. Where's Pete gone? He's hiding away back there. Pete was very kind in going out onto riverbanks and collecting otter business, okay, otter poo, and we were looking in the poo at what they'd been eating, and we were finding lots and lots and lots of alien non-native crayfish, just like you're looking at now, albeit in a more pure form than we were finding. And this was interesting, or very interesting to us, because at the time we weren't really sure whether we did have signal crayfish in the Hampshire Avon, whereas we did confirm from Salisbury down to Christchurch, these guys maybe not quite as big as this beast, but we certainly have signal crayfish and we're certainly invading. So in terms of the impact a signal crayfish can have, I'm not saying this is happening yet on the Avon, but the literature is full of examples of impact on invertebrates, on fish, and so on. So very, very damaging, or potentially very, very damaging. If you don't believe me, we're in this post-truth, this we don't believe experts anymore, well, let's go and look at the media. We've got the Sun, the Mail, the Telegraph, and so on, all with this same common message, okay? This message that non-native species, when they become invasive, very damaging, very pervasive, very, very difficult to manage. So why do I think you guys should be interested? Well, I would say is because no matter what you do, you can take your dog for a walk, you can walk along the riverbank, you can take a boat trip across the harbour, wherever you look, the chances are at some point in your daily life you're going to be seeing a non-native species, and there's a high chance it will be a species which has or is about to become invasive. Okay? When we're talking about non-native species, I'm not just talking about them in a local context. Yes, locally it's important. It ground truths us. It gives us relevance to our everyday lives, but nationally as well. We've got Adrian Taylor, who is an ex-colleague of mine from the Environment Agency, did a lot of work at the national level in developing policy around fish movement and trying to stop, as part of that, non-native fish in this context being introduced. So again, important at a national level, but also globally. And I'll be giving examples today which really are talking about things in a more global context. We have species you find all around the world, just like Coca-Cola and McDonald's. You find some species no matter where you go, pretty much. So I'm going to centre my talk, or the rest of my talk this evening, around 4 statements or questions. Okay? And what I'm then going to do is elaborate on that question and say, well, is it true? And I should say false, but in the current climate, maybe post-truth. Okay? So in terms of that statement, is it true? Is it false? So the first one is around the benefits we get from non-native species and invasive species. Can we get benefits? Can we get economic benefits? That's very, very important. The second one goes back to our red squirrel, grey squirrel example around diseases. So can they bring novel diseases that cause impacts to our native species? Third one, are the worst invaders those which are small-bodied? Can they start invasions from very small founding numbers, very small numbers being introduced? If that's the case, how does the population develop from that point onwards? And the last one is really around management. If I'm going to stand here for the next 20 minutes, 30 minutes, talking in the context of species being very damaging, well, what on earth are we going to do about it? What can we do about it? And we'll find out a bit later on. So before we go any further, because I need a drink more than anything else, I'm going to stop a second and just check we're all happy so far. Yeah? Not too hot? Not about to pass out from being so crammed together? No? Good. Okay, so I'm going to look really, when I say socioeconomic benefits, I'm seeing in the corner of my eye John Fletcher down here, who's an economist. And so I need to kind of give some caveat that I'm not going into a great socio-economic model or anything like that. I'm just using a nice example. But my example is fish here, the common carp. And the common carp, as you see in a moment, really is a McDonald's fish. It's a Coca-Cola fish. Anywhere in the world you'll find it pretty much. And we're going to go and look at the example in Lake Naivasha, which is in Kenya. Before we go any further, then yeah, absolutely, carp really is one of the world's worst invaders. It's on the list of the world's worst 100, and I've just taken 3 random examples, if you like, from the literature, but I could have chosen hundreds and hundreds, lots and lots of examples. Why are they so damaging? Well, if I just flick back here, it doesn't maybe show it terribly well, but his mouth here protrudes. Okay, it extends and it feeds very much on the bottom of lakes. So if you can see this table, everyone, if you can't imagine it, okay, and it grubs around in all the mud and it stirs it all up. Okay, if there is what I would call a macrophyte, what you'd maybe call a water plant, okay, it uproots the macrophytes, they break down, releases all the nutrients. So if you start off with a really beautiful clear lake, beautiful clear water, introduce carp, and maybe 2 or 3 years later, you'll have a water body which is brown, no macrophyte, and full potentially of carp. If you're an angler, that may be great. If you're an ecologist, that's probably very bad. So we're talking about Lake Naivasha. So anyone who's flown to Kenya to go on holiday, on safari, for example, will have no doubt flown into Nairobi. Anyone been to Nairobi? Yeah, quite a few of you. Yeah, interesting place. Okay, most people go to Nairobi, go straight to the hotel, and then go straight out again on safari. Okay, if you go down to the coast, you may go to Mombasa, down here on the Indian Ocean. But Lake Naivasha is neither on the coast or really in Nairobi, but it's not very far from Nairobi. Okay, it's only about an hour and a half drive. As we'll see in due course, it has pretty good infrastructure, so it has good roads, so it's quite easy to get to. maybe rather than just talking just about Naivasha, it's just worth taking a bit of a step back, just digress slightly. So I'm aware there's lots of younger scientists in the room, as well as maybe some older ones too. And I guess one message I would say is if you have the opportunity to travel, to work in other locations, it doesn't have to be East Africa, it could be anywhere. But in doing so, the ability to broaden your horizons, see things in a slightly different context is very, very important. And I first went to Kenya when I was 28, which seemed, it doesn't just seem, it was a long time ago, okay, unfortunately. And when I first went out there, it was quite mind-blowing, I'll be quite honest, because I'm used to working in this country, okay, or Northern Europe, which, let's face it, it's September and it's already a bit chilly outside, okay? So it's very temperate in its climate, okay, very seasonal. So the growth season for animals like fish is relatively short. It's maybe 3 or 4 months. Out there, it's pretty much all year round, okay? If you jump into, this is Lake Baringo, which is another freshwater lake. If you jump in there, it's like jumping in a nice warm bath, okay? Whereas if you jump into Poole Harbour tonight, well, it's probably like an ice bath, okay? But I certainly hope you don't try that later. But of course, you also get exposed to a whole load of other experiences, wildlife and so on. But also, if you're somebody like me who works in water, the level of risk and your risk assessment is quite different. So you may set your fishing net somewhere along here, you come back a couple of hours later and find a herd of hippos have moved in. Or you lift your nets up, maybe you've been sampling overnight and you find a massive hole where a hippo has just come along and gone straight through it. Alternatively, you may lift your net, really excited, you're going to catch all these fish, and you just have skeletons, because the crocodiles have eaten them all, okay? All of which are pretty annoying. The other thing with crocodiles, sometimes, when you set out, I'd fish what's called a gill net, I put a float at each end, a nice visible float. The crocodiles would basically go up and attack it and then swim off with your net. So again, pretty irritating stuff. The other level of threat, which is quite different, is, this guy here, very helpful, good fisherman. You probably can't quite tell, but he's just removed a tilapia from my fishing net for me. Fantastic, okay, free help. But about 5 minutes before, he came over with a big bullet belt on, AK-47. There's been some tribal difficulties in the region overnight. Oh my goodness, this wasn't in my risk assessment. What's going to happen here? But extremely helpful. But the level of threat, the things you've experienced are completely different. So if anyone does have the opportunity, then I would say always, always take it. It was pretty famous globally as a really beautiful clear water lake. Okay, so here, in between these lilies, you'd be able to see down to the bottom of a lake in maybe 2 meters of water. See the fish swimming around. All the nutrients are locked up in these plants here, so there's very little algae. Sorry, Dan. Okay, Dan's our resident algologist, if that's the right word. And so consequently, that's a lake which, visually is very attractive, but ecologically has very high status as well. Really beautiful. If we went to Naivasha today, if only, if we went tomorrow, let's say, we wouldn't see all these lily pads. Instead, we'd be seeing lots of brown water, fringed here with non-native plants, and then fringed beyond with lots and lots of greenhouses. What's growing in the greenhouses? Well, it would be these, okay? These flowers, okay? Roses in particular. And that's important. One, it's important locally, and globally, I suppose, but certainly locally in socio-economic terms, that much is true. Big earner of export duties, huge amount of money and employment. But the flip side of that is he uses a huge amount of water. I mean, these, I'm pretty certain, these were bought from Tesco a few hours ago. These are probably 80 or 90% Lake Naivasha water. If I was a betting man, I'm not sure how much I'd put on that, but I'd be willing to put a decent bet on that. Okay. So I'm pretty certain most flowers, particularly we buy in this country from supermarkets in winter, come from Kenya and probably come from Lake Naivasha. Why is that important? Well, they abstract huge amounts of water. So the lake level is artificially being reduced. Okay, that's damaging for lake ecology. Years ago, in the 1970s, crayfish, a bit like those guys I just passed around, they were introduced and they ate all of those plants. Okay, so we have very few plants. All those nutrients are now released into the water. All the algae can thrive on that, so we end up with a brown lake and lots of greenhouses, but also lots of jobs. So I certainly wouldn't say it's all bad news. But in this story as well are fish. Okay, fish are very important. We're talking about a country is developing, poverty levels. Fish are crucial for food security and alleviating poverty. Very, very important. And the lake does support a very important, but also low technology fishery based on gill nets. And I say low technology, this mast here is made out of fertilizer sacks, woven together. So very low technology, but these guys know how to fish. Okay, they really do. No engines, all hand power. And they're always exploiting a very limited fish fauna. Lake Naivasha has had periods of drying and then water levels increasing. It's not like maybe any fish keepers, any tropical fish keepers here? Yeah? Anyone keep cichlids? Anyone go to the aquarium shop and ever look at or maybe the range near up at Turby Retail Park? There's a beautiful tank of fish there. And chances are they're from either Lake Malawi or Lake Victoria or somewhere such as that, where these fish have had millions of years to really speciate into brilliant colours. Lake Naivasha was dry maybe 200 years ago. Okay? So since then, a lot of these fish have been introduced really for their fishery. These guys here are both East African species. This is the largemouth bass I mentioned earlier from North America. It was introduced in the 1920s. And one thing you will see here, this is fish catches going from 1960 to the early 2000s. Okay, there's periods where there's a bit of an improvement, but in general, it's a decreasing pattern. Catches going down over time. And of course, if you're talking about food security, that's very, very bad. So where do carp fit into this picture? Well, if I just flick back here, in this period, really bad period of catches, it was followed actually by this big peak here. And that big peak coincided with a huge amount of rainfall, big floods, the lake filled up, and the tilapia species reproduced very, very well. But also, this is a river feeding the lake. Carp in the catchment, in a fish farm, flooded, escaped into the lake, 1998. 2001, someone walking along the lake found this bizarre fish, never seen it before, being eaten by a fish eagle. What was it? The picture was sent around to various people, and the consensus was it was a carp. I first went out in Naivasha in 2002, and indeed we caught carp and saw carp in the fishery. Progress a little bit further, you'll see the traditional fish in the catches, the tilapia, disappearing over time, and all of a sudden replaced by this purple, which is carp. So the fishermen gave up on catching their traditional species and instead started catching carp. Now, I've already said earlier, one big problem is carp are highly invasive, very, very damaging. So being the doom mongers we were, we said, well, this is going to be horrendous. Naivasha, I mentioned those plants earlier, those beautiful macrophytes and lilies. Well, they would never come back. There's no way we'd see those ever, ever again. So these water plants here, they're gone for good. So 7 years after carp, I went back, and all of a sudden, everywhere I looked was loads and loads of macrophytes. Okay, so talking about experts being wrong, well, there we go. Okay, you don't need further proof. Everywhere we went, 2006, this waterweed all over the place, and yet we predicted that would never happen again. Okay, so what happened? Well, I won't go into detail on this. We don't really have the time tonight. Well, I would happily talk for another 2 hours on this, but I think you might get a bit fed up of that. But why did all of this weed reappear? Well, I mentioned the crayfish. I passed around the crayfish, eating all the water plants. Well, the carp were eating the crayfish, which released the pressure on the weeds, and they all regenerated. So arguably, counterintuitively, you could say the carp had a big ecological benefit. I would say that's probably more because of how degraded Naivasha was in the first place. But, again, that was a slight digression. So to come back to our original question, do we see socio-economic benefits from carp? Well, in the context of Lake Naivasha, okay, today, we're going to the latest data I've published on this, about 4 years ago, catches today dominated by carp. Fishermen are catching big numbers of carp. They're feeding families with great big fish full of protein. So it's very difficult to argue that that isn't a really big benefit. I would certainly argue that it is. So truth or post-truth, well, aquatic invaders can provide substantial socio-economic benefits. Yeah, I'll say they do. And I think it's important to always realise that, because when it comes to communicating to the wider public, if we always say that non-native species, invasive species are bad, then actually a lot of species give us a huge amount of benefits, and so we're really not understanding the full picture. I wouldn't, however, say you should introduce carp everywhere. I think Naivasha is a very extreme example, but I would also say a really interesting one. Are we all okay still, guys? Have I still got you, yeah? We're still okay. I can see a few nods. I can't see too many drooping eyelids. That's good, okay? So, I've already mentioned the grey squirrel and the red squirrel conundrum, and particularly the virus carried by the grey squirrel. So we're now going to be looking really at novel diseases that invasive species can bring along. I'm going to look at it. One example is River Froome in Dorset, on our doorstep, comes into Poole Harbour. Again, very locally relevant. The invader is a word I'm going to struggle to pronounce. It used to be called, a few years ago, Angelicola cratus. And I started working on it, and his name was changed to A. cratus. Okay? Because I'm not going to pronounce that very, very easily. But again, before we go into the detail on the example, one thing that you will notice if you look hard enough is when we talk about a non-native species being introduced, if we go into the native range, we may find it's got maybe 20 or 30 parasites. In its new range, it only has maybe 4 or 5. So alien species, invasive species, non-native species, whatever we want to call them, very often lose a huge amount of, or a very large proportion of their parasites in this process. And this actually is extremely advantageous. It's a big advantage because no longer are you burdened with loss of parasites, so all the energy you were wasting on the parasites is now being used for growth and reproduction and so on. And if you can see here, it's called the enemy release hypothesis. So one question would be, well, how does that work? Well, there's a lot of different reasons, but one reason would be, well, I'm looking out to maybe, 100 people, okay? If I did a big parasite check on all of you, okay, heaven forbid, but just say I decided to do so, maybe I'd have a list of maybe 100 or 200 parasites, maybe, hopefully, before less. But let's just stay with me. Let's just say you're all really parasitized, riddled with them, okay, and we've got, say, 200 species, yeah? Happy so far-ish. Not really. Okay, that's okay. Got lots of treatment I can give you later. Now, if I wanted to introduce some of you guys into a new location, maybe I don't want to take all 100 of you. I'm just going to take a proportion down here. Maybe these guys are actually, these are actually quite clean. Okay, these guys are good. They don't have many parasites. Okay. So consequently, I'll just take you selection. I'm going to transport you into a new location and release you. So although my population in the native range, you guys, have 200 parasites, the ones I'm selecting only have 5 or 6. They're very healthy. So immediately, they're not being exposed to all of these parasites you guys have got. Big, big advantage. Okay? The downside for these guys, though, is when they go into their new range, all the parasites in that range may then attack them. Okay? So they might get very sick very quickly. We've got new students coming back, okay, as undergraduates at this time of year. we're going to be attacked by all sorts of bugs in the next few weeks, okay? So we'll be acquiring parasites and pathogens, no doubt, in the next few months. But this enemy release hypothesis is very, very important, okay? Because what it means is when you move animals around the world, you're not always moving huge numbers of diseases and pathogens, but the important thing is those that you do introduce can be very, very damaging. We've already had our squirrel example. That's a very good one. The squirrels don't swim easily, that I'm aware of. Okay, so I can't use that as an example, so I'm sticking to aquatics. Okay, so I am going to be talking about this gentleman here. Okay, it's a parasite. I mean, I don't have a scale on there, but it's quite big. I mean, we're talking about a parasite which even I can see, I can work with, so it's pretty big. And it's found naturally in the Japanese eel, okay, and Anguilla japonicus. And Japonicus was brought into Europe, really, I put here for culture, I should have put aquaculture. It's not coming to see the cinema or the theatre, it's all about aquaculture. Okay, aquaculture is a big mover of animals around the world. And so for aquaculture and food, and ultimately when you're moving fish like this around the world, their parasites or those that do get through will escape into the wild. And so unfortunately you can't see the detail on here, but basically you've got in mainland Europe, this parasite here was found in the European eel. Okay, so it switched from Japanese eels to European eels in the 1980s. It hopped across, it didn't swim across, but it got across to the UK or Great Britain in 1987, when there was another lag period before it was discovered in Ireland. So this movement of species, non-native species, going from Northern Europe into Britain, into Ireland, is actually fairly common in many species, particularly with fish. But yeah, we've certainly had it in this country for maybe 30 years now. And if you ever do look at eels, and Josie down here can talk about it later, I'm sure, over a glass of wine. In terms of Josie's work, everywhere we looked in eels for this particular parasite, we were finding them. And maybe 60% or so of eels would have the parasite at any given time. Why is it important? Well, this guy here, this is within the eel. That's an eel that's unfortunately been chopped up. And this here is what's called a swim bladder. So why is a swim bladder important? Well, if you're an eel and you're swimming along, it's important to regulate where you're swimming in the water column. Now, if you're swimming in a river, it probably doesn't matter too much. You could have loads and loads of parasites damaging your swim bladder, but if the water's only, 2 meters deep, you're not really too fussed. But those of you who know about eels will know one characteristic of them is where they reproduce. And they reproduce in the South Atlantic, Sargasso Sea. Okay, so they come into fresh water, the small elvers, stay in fresh water 3 years, 5 years, sometimes 20 years, sometimes even 30 years. Okay, then they have to go back to reproduce. Now, if your swim bladder has been pretty much destroyed by this parasite, and in this one there's around 50 parasites, all about 1 inch or 2 inches long, 4 or 5 centimeters, 6 centimeters, its function is really impaired. Okay? Now, when eels go back into the South Atlantic, here we go, they are swimming back, honestly. Okay, swimming back, and I'll probably get this the wrong way around, but I think in the daytime they tend to swim around 600 meters deep, come up to about 100 meters deep at night, and so on. Okay, for whatever reason, but for regulating the depth. Whereas, presumably, if your swim bladder no longer functions, you'll swim out of Poole Harbour, quite happy, maybe swim out into the channel, maybe past France, or this is for life. All of a sudden you hit the continental shelf, big deep water, and potentially boof, straight to the bottom. What do I do now? Well, chances are you're going to be eaten or you're going to die. You're not going to reproduce. And if you're an eel or any animal and you don't complete your life cycle, that's pretty bad news. Okay? And really, this parasite is not the only factor, but is one very important factor in a number of factors which has resulted in the European eel now being listed as being critically endangered. Now, we're very lucky in Dorset. We have Poole Harbour, connected rivers, we have lots of eels, But across their European range, these guys, because of things like poor recruitment, are really struggling. Okay? So here's the eel, being assessed as critically endangered. The panda, what do we know about pandas? Well, we know they struggle to reproduce. We have to watch them in zoos, pretty much. Okay? But in the wild, you probably can't see the detail there, but they're only classed as vulnerable. So the eel, far more endangered across its range than the panda. So this picture here, very, very rare. Not because I'm looking happy, although that is pretty rare, to be fair, okay? Because actually this guy here, critically endangered. But I do accept that, you know, they are locally still quite abundant. But that is important because sometimes we don't give our native species the credit they deserve. And I think the eel is certainly one of those. Anyone who goes fishing and catches eels by mistake will probably curse them and probably glad they're critically endangered. But ultimately, yeah, they are in a perilous state. So let's come back to our parasite. There's our big eel up at the top, quite happy. Maybe he's got the parasite. If he or she does have a parasite, the parasite will be releasing eggs. The eel will poo out the eggs. The eggs will then be eaten by what's called a copepod, a crustacean, a small, I was going to say microscopic animal, not necessarily, they may be fairly big. Okay? Then it may be eaten by the eel and it completes a circle. But also, because of this little guy down here, is superb fish food. Okay? Any fish keeper will know that. They'll also be eaten by little fish. Okay? Now these guys will develop a parasite, but the parasite can't go any further. It can't complete its life cycle. So here it's called a parotenic host. Okay? So they carry the parasite, but they can't do anything else until Mr. Eel comes and eats him, because eels love eating fish and they love eating these guys. Okay? So this here is a very important part of the parasite life cycle. Why? Well, it's because when you look at eels in a bit more depth and detail, you find actually you get two types. You get eels like this chap. It's a bit like an arrow on his head, very, very narrow, okay? Whereas this guy here, whoops, is much broader in his head. Why is that important? What advantage does it give you if you've got a nice big fat head, broad head, versus a narrow head? Well, this guy here, a narrow head, if he tries to eat a fish, he's got a very small mouth. How's he going to do it? He can't fit it in, okay? He hasn't got his mouth can't open enough to eat a nice big fish. Whereas this guy here, it's a very broad head, a much wider mouth, can go behind a fish and whoomph straight in, okay? So what you tend to find is the eels with a much narrower head tend to have a very invertebrate-based diet, and the broad-headed guys like this guy here have a fish-based diet, okay? So if we just move on to this slide here, all this is here on the bottom is basically the values here. This is a broad head, that's a narrow head, okay? So if you look at the amount of fish in the diet, as the heads get larger or more broad, you get more fish in their diet, okay? So when you then start looking at differences in these relationships between the eels with the parasite and without the parasite, you tend to find that actually the ones with the parasite are the ones with the big heads and eating lots of fish, okay? So if this parasite is causing a lot of problems in the eel, that risk to the individual eel is being dictated to some extent by its head morphology. So these guys here will be far more probable, far more likely to have the parasite than this guy here. And yet, normally when you have a fish-based diet, it's much better because it gives you much more energy. You can grow much bigger. So maybe the trade-off there is you can grow big, but your swim bladder really gets destroyed in doing so. So, there's our statement. Aquatic invaders can bring novel diseases. I think we can say that's true. Okay? Not many. The guys down here have demonstrated they're pretty clean, okay? So whatever they're carrying may be fine, okay? Let's hope so, okay? But those that do get through, it could be the Crassus parasite of eel, it could be the virus carried by the grey squirrels, can be very threatening. And that threat can really be at a species level as well as a population level. So our next one is really looking at a species I've been working on for probably 15 years or more, called the topmouth gudgeon. Whoops. This guy here. The first thing you'll notice is not very big, okay? I'd say this one here is a male, that's a female. This guy here is about 7 centimeters. That's pretty big. So we're talking about a pretty small fish, okay? Highly invasive, they're from Southeast Asia, came into Europe in the 1950s, spread across Europe since then, came into England in the 1980s, actually not very far from here, only in Hampshire, near Eastleigh. But one thing that we've certainly noticed in England, they haven't yet really become very invasive, but I'll return to that point later on. But the question I really want to answer here is how do you go from maybe 2 or 3 or 4 fish like this to huge numbers here? If this is a net, it's a 25-meter net, and outside of these 2 carp here, there's around 64 kilos of fish. I don't know if that sounds impressive, it does to me, but to me it's even more impressive when I say that actually it's composed entirely of these topmouth gudgeon, and each of these fish is maybe no more than a gram each. They were discovered in this lake only 2 years prior to this sample being taken. So they went from very low number to a huge number, a mega number, a colossal number in a very short amount of time. So my question really is, well, how on earth does that happen? That seems almost bizarre. So the question really is, how do you get an invasion from a small number of founding numbers? So if you start with 10 fish or 20 fish, how many are you going to have 2 years' time or 3 years' time? So I'm going to give you guys 2 scenarios. First one, if I give you 2 topmouth gudgeon, your garden pond, if you have one. If you don't, dig one. Okay? Put them in. Dig another pond next door. Take 50 topmouth gudgeon. I should have said you'll have a male and a female in your first one. That's pretty much a prerequisite for these guys. So I'm going to give you 25 males and 25 females. Put them in your pond next door. Come back, what, a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later. Which one of those is most likely, I should say more probable, to have resulted in a sustainable population? Anyone think this one? The first one? Anyone think the second one? Yeah? Why? No, I can hear lots of them. I would think it's fairly obvious, yeah? If you introduce 2, what happens if one gets eaten by a heron the next day? Well, that's it, isn't it? It's finished. It's done, okay? Nothing's happened. If you have a heron having breakfast every day, well, the chances are there's still going to be some fish alive. When it comes to reproductive season, consequently, you're going to get probably a population. But if we look at it in a more theoretical context, and we're all scientists tonight, okay, so in a theoretical context, this is called propagular pressure, okay? So propagular pressure is just the number of individuals you release or the number of occasions you release them. So you could release 50 or you could release 5 fish on 10 occasions. Your propagular pressure is arguably the same. So as propagular pressure increases, your probability of a population in a few years' time also increases. But how that relationship works is arguably, at least to me, hopefully to you guys, very, very interesting. Because it may be, I'll do it from here, line C would just be your probability increases in proportion to the number of introductions you make, or the number of fish you release. If it was A, here, you don't need many individuals before you get a very high probability of introduction. If it's D, you need a lot. And if it's B, then there's clearly a big threshold. So the potential for these different relationships which may appear quite abstract, but actually underpinning this theory are very, very important. So we did some work around this a few years ago, really testing it over 3 years. Started off with 0 in some ponds. Why 0? If we came back a year later and found top-mouth gudgeon where there should be none, well, we're just wasting our time, aren't we? Okay. So we have a control. We had 2, 10, 20, 50, and so on. So we went from basically a very tiny, very small popliteal pressure to a very, very large. And wherever possible, in an equal sex ratio, and no other fish present to confuse us. So we're going to skip to year 3. And what do we see? Well, we see at 0, where you introduce no fish, you still have no fish. That's a relief. Okay, that's good news. Okay, so far so good. Introduce 1 pair on here, and I should say this is the proportion of populations, which, or the proportion of populations that actually developed. So we had 5 replicates at 1 pair, and 1 of those did produce a population. So 2 fish in a small pond did produce a population, did become sustainable, which I was really quite staggered at, I'll be honest. That's a pretty good effort. Okay, 5 pairs goes up a bit more, but as soon as you go to 10 pairs or more, they all established. Okay, so one message is you don't need many to have a population. You need what appears to be some form of threshold kind of around here somewhere. So if we go back to here, it would be curve B. Curve B is the one underpinning top-mouth gudgeon establishment. You may ask, hopefully you'd be a bit more interested to follow it a bit further, to say, well, if you start with 2, surely you won't have many 3 years later. And I'd agree, because, yeah, we may have had an established population, but still not very many. But of the higher numbers, you actually have a huge number of fish. So going back to what I was saying about, and I'm going to flick back to here, how do you go from here to loads, and why do you suddenly find 1 year you have huge numbers when the year before you had none? It's really because of this relationship. Whoops. You just need a threshold of a number of adults to reproduce, and all of a sudden you'll have a lot the next year. The other question is, well, if you are only 2 or 10 of you, how do you survive? How do you make sure you reproduce? Well, what you do with these guys is you grow really quickly. Why, as a fish, do you grow quickly? Well, you grow quickly so you can reproduce as soon as possible. Okay? Because if you don't, you might get eaten by the heron or by a fish or die anyway. Okay? So these guys are growing. I mean, that's incredibly fast, and it means they develop quickly, sexually mature, and reproduce, maybe at age 1 or less. These guys, whoops, it doesn't really matter. There's loads of them anyway. If they start spawning at age 2 or 3, doesn't matter. Okay? These guys, if they spawn at age 2 or 3, they'll probably find there's no one there to spawn with. Okay? They run out of partners, there's no one left. So in terms certainly of these small founding numbers, then yes, you can start an invasion from small numbers, but it is far better to start your invasion from large numbers. We don't have time this evening, unfortunately, to look at some of the impacts on these guys, but these guys, again, going back to the disease, carry a really nasty disease for our native species. So again, I don't know where Demetra is. I've seen her somewhere. She's right at the back. If you do want to know a bit more about diseases around top-mouth gudgeon, then find Demetra in the cafe later, and I'm sure she'll be able to tell you about it. So, we're moving on to our final part, really, where really we've spoken a little bit now about the science, the kind of the ecology, and the key thing now really is to apply that. How can we apply this to making a difference in the wild? So I'm going to say, well, aquatic invaders, or indeed all invasive species, are difficult to manage in the environment. Location is certainly global, and yeah, I'd say we're talking really about all invasive species. So given these things I've been saying about invasive species, I've mentioned diseases, I've mentioned producing very large populations very, very quickly. What else did we speak about earlier? I've been talking so long I've forgotten, okay? We cause all these different impacts, okay? So what can we do about it? Do we have any tools we can use to try and manage these species? Because arguably, particularly if you're a practitioner, I know there's guys in here tonight who are more of a sharp end of conservation than I am, that really would be their question. But when you certainly look within the literature on this, then really, are we any good at managing invasive species? My answer would be, well, at least fish, no, not really. And to be frank, we're not very good at it anywhere in the world, okay? At least not at, pretty big spatial scales, okay? But why? Why are they so difficult to manage? Well, part of it is, I would say, these 4 points here. When do you make a decision to manage a species? Because to manage a species, particularly an animal, what you're really talking about is killing it. And that brings in an ethical dimension. So it's very, very difficult. So when to actually do it? But arguably, more importantly, is, well, who's going to pay? It costs a lot of money, okay? And who should pay? What tends to happen is who will pay, you'll have to come from a public purse. But if it's been caused by a private individual, then you have this trade-off between the two. Should it be down to polluter pays principle? Well, then the polluter probably won't pay. So it's very, very difficult. How much will it cost? Costs a lot. Who should pay? Good question. It needs a lot of political will. By that, it really, should we do this, guys? Are we really sure it's worth spending all this money, getting all this potentially bad publicity, and killing all these invasive species? Are we actually going to be prepared to see this through to the end? And that takes a lot of political will to do that. But arguably, the other important aspect is this one. If we wanted to tackle, let's say, signal crayfish, we have them in Hampshire Avon, we have them down in Devon, we have them all the way through the country. Where on earth are you going to start? It's just too late. If you wanted to tackle grey squirrels in this country, for a very good reason, to bring back the red squirrels, well, where do you start? They're all over. Are you going to start shooting grey squirrels across the country? You probably won't be able to do that. Or at least it'll be very difficult to do that. At least, and this last statement is also very important, because if you're dealing particularly in the aquatic environment, if you want to tackle species, you're probably going to have to use a poison. And most poisons are not species specific. They are very general. So you end up killing everything. So again, that is ultimately very, very damaging. And can you use them in Poole Harbour or River Froome? Probably not. So even if you wanted to do it, even if you decided to do it, you had the money, you had the will, you knew it was in time, you probably still couldn't do it. So it's very, very difficult. And I'm sure you're all sat there, as I would be, thinking, well, surely the thing to do is make sure they don't get introduced. Surely that's the most effective thing to do. Again, I would agree entirely. But that's the sort of thing you say when you're sat behind a desk, okay? As I do pretty much on a daily basis. Whereas in reality, these species do get introduced, sometimes, complying with regulations, and sometimes not. So how do we then prioritize managing one species over another? Well, I'm sure all of you, when you go back to your workplaces, will have some risk assessments. Maybe a health and safety risk assessment. Yeah, all familiar, pretty much. I can see rolling of eyes, talking about risk assessment. Oh, okay. But very important, aren't they? They keep us safe in our offices, in our daily work. Well, an invasion risk assessment is very, very similar. Okay? So rather than identifying a whole load of tasks and the controls to minimize the risk of that task, what a risk assessment for an invasive species will do is tell you how damaging, how invasive it would be. Okay? So this system here just gives you a score between about 0 and generally around 40. The higher the score, the higher the risk of an invasion and damage from that species. Very simple, but underlying these scores are around 48 to 50 questions in grade depth where you have to answer them sequentially and do all the reading around that. So it's very, very important. They're quite complex. But if you have a very high-risk species like these guys here, if they're already very widespread, well, I've already said we can't do anything. Okay, it's too late. They're all across the country. How on earth do you spend millions and millions of pounds to tackle them? You don't have millions and millions of pounds. It's not going to happen. So these guys here, 22 is the common carp, 23 here is the goldfish, not the bright yellow goldfish or goldfish, but the wild form of goldfish, brown goldfish, okay? And brown goldfish, potentially very, very damaging, but it doesn't matter because they're already very, very widespread. But this box here, high risk, restricted in distribution, maybe only in less than 50 waters, all of a sudden you have the ability to take action. And what is this fish here? This guy here is the topmouth gudgeon, which I spoke about a few moments ago. So a topmouth gudgeon in England, you could argue, should be very high priority because it's very high risk. I've mentioned the disease, see Demetra later, and it's very restricted in distribution. And importantly, that distribution is all within ponds, not in rivers, all in ponds, okay? So it means that actually you can take direct action against it. And indeed, the Environment Agency over the last decade has been doing that, okay? So using a poison called rotenone, they've been basically eradicating populations in these ponds to very high effect, okay? I would say 10 years ago we had probably 30 populations. Today we have maybe 4, okay? At least that we know about. So that's making a big, big difference. It's not doing much for my research. I can't get topmouth gudgeon anymore, okay? That's a bit of a blow for me, okay? But ultimately, making a big benefit, and the biggest benefit is this statement down at the bottom. Because the topmouth gudgeon are no longer able to disperse, remember what I said right at the beginning with that invasion pathway? To be invasive, you have to spread, you have to impact, where they can impact, but they can't spread because of the action these guys are taking. So on one hand, you could argue these are being very, very, let's say, damaging, very intrusive, is kind of, very, very brutal almost, if you like, but at the same time, it is very, very effective. The interesting thing, because we're working on fish, people don't seem to care about fish so much. It hasn't really attracted any great kind of negative aspect. It's been seen very beneficially. And indeed, it's been on for one show a couple of years ago, for example. So it's a really nice example of where you've been able to take a risk assessment like this, identify a high-risk species where you can still take action and actually have a result from that. Oops. So in terms of aquatic invaders being difficult to manage, then I'd say, yeah, in general terms, that is undoubtedly true. Okay? It's almost impossible, but with some exceptions. And indeed, although it's not a fish, an aquatic potential invader that has been eradicated in this country is the koipu. It's a big furry mammal, okay, that was in Eastern England. So it can be done, So, where are we at now? Nearly in the cafe, okay. Not quite though. So I would say in summary, one reason, a major reason why I think you guys should be interested in non-native species, particularly invasive species, is because they are all around us, locally, nationally, globally. Okay? I've mentioned common carp. Okay? There's common carp on the doorstep here. Yet I fly all the way to Kenya to work on common carp. What am I doing? Coca-Cola, McDonald's, common carp, all the same. Okay? And all of these species are coming from human activities. Yes, occasionally we talk about accidental introductions. The topmouth gudgeon, I should have said earlier, is entirely from accidental introductions. But a lot are intentional. Why are they intentional? Because actually, we've already seen, they can be very beneficial to societies, to us. Okay? It's only that small proportion that are really invasive and highly damaging that have a problem. But those ones can have very big issues. We spoke about disease, squirrels, eels, and so on. Managing them is certainly very difficult. If you do want to do it, generally speaking, it takes a lot of effort, a lot of time, and a lot of money. The future, what's going to happen in the next 50 years, undoubtedly, chances are, well, I'd say undoubtedly, yeah, there will be more species. We'll get new species all the time. We will get new controls, or maybe new legislation. Hopefully, there'll be new technologies to help manage these species. But of course, we're in an era of global changes, global environmental changes, climate change, for example. So when we take a non-native species like a European catfish, allied with climate change in this country, we may find in future we find some enormous catfish in this country. This is an invasive catfish in Italy, about 100 kilos. This is an invasive catfish in France, and can you see what it's doing? It's eating the pigeons, okay? So maybe he has a good control measure, who knows, okay, it could happen. Okay, well, thank you guys for listening. Before I do finish and take questions, I just first of all want to thank my funders, okay? It was all extremely appreciated, but also, and I think this last point is very important, what I've tried to do in this talk is give you a flavour of the work I've been doing in the last 20 years or so. But when I say I've been doing, that's a little bit of a misnomer, okay? Good science, science that is robust, takes effort, it takes collaborations. So I want to thank, first of all, mentors and supervisors in the past, such as Ian Cowkes, the late Phil Hickley, Rodolphe Goldsland, who's been very important to me early in my career at Bournemouth. Also, my PhD students and postdoctoral assistants. Again, it's a joy to work with you all. But also, the one problem with research, very enjoyable, but it takes time, okay? So really, for support, for helping me do my work is very important. So I'd like to thank all of you as well, and you too. Thank you.